Well, welcome everybody. Thanks for coming this morning. We've been doing these weekend webinars for some time, and we think everybody's enjoying them. A little bit about me. First, I'm not a lawyer. I'm a Strata owner, just like most of you. I've been a Strata owner since 1992, and I always remember the date because my Strata fees were $92 in 92. Sorry if you've heard that before. I'm a former Visoa board member. I was on the board for about 12 years, 8 of them as president. Currently in my strata that I'm in now, I'm the treasurer. In the past, in other stratas, I've been the secretary many times. I've been vice president, been treasurer, never had the pleasure of being president of my strata. Currently, I'm a civil servant here in the province of BC. I hope your files don't look like that. What will we cover today? So we'll talk about what the Strata Property Act requires for record keeping, what the regulation says, what do your bylaws say? We'll give you some best practices from experience, and we'll talk about what's different if you have a strata manager. We'll go over briefly how to respond to requests for records, and we'll talk about whether the CRT or the courts have addressed records, and we'll give you some additional information as well, some additional resources. We're not going to talk about, we're not going to touch very much on privacy as it relates to record keeping. It's a whole separate topic, a very large topic, and we will have a separate webinar on that coming up soon, because otherwise we'd be here for hours. And we don't want you to be here for hours. We want you to enjoy your Saturday morning. So what does the Strata Property Act require for your records? So for the most part, you want to go to Section 35 of the Strata Property Act. It lists all the records that the strata must prepare or keep. Things like minutes, lists of owners and tenants, strata plan, copy of the Strata Property Act. Did you know you need to keep a copy of that on hand? Copies of your bylaws and rules, your correspondence, any limited common property designations, any legal decisions and opinions, and it goes on. It's very long. Books of account, budget and financial statements, bank statements, income tax returns, Form Bs, depreciation reports, common property inspection reports, and so much more. And if you look it up in the actual act, it's a page and a half. So we're not going to go in detail. You can look that up yourself. Now, Section 36 of the Strata Property Act identifies who's entitled to see or receive copies of those records. So owners, of course, are entitled to see those records. Tenants who've been assigned the landlord's rights, and any person authorized in writing by owners or those tenants who've been authorized in writing. Who've been assigned the landlord's rights. So this is where realtors will frequently come in. They're going to be the person identified here as C, any person authorized in writing by A or B. And also former owners and former tenants do have the ability to access records, but only to records from their time in that strata. But then also any person authorized in writing by one of those former owners or former tenants. So see Section 36 for the specific details of who's entitled to see or receive copies of those records. And we'll go into that in more detail. So what does the Strata Property Regulation say? So the regulation identifies how long each type of document must be retained. And if you've ever tried to read the regulation, it's very confusing. There's a range of times that you need to keep specific documents. For example, legal opinions need to be kept permanently. Contracts need to be kept for 6 years. Correspondence needs to be kept for 2 years. Depreciation report needs to just keep the current copy. And so there's a wide range, and it's very difficult to read. So we actually had a volunteer Visoa member some years ago who made up a table that lists it and makes it very simple for you to just click to the table and see how long a specific document needs to be retained. And we have that up on our website. Now, just because these are the minimum lengths of time you need to keep something doesn't mean you can't keep it longer if you have space and the ability to do so. And I can tell you it's definitely helpful to keep things longer than is required. Now, what do your bylaws say? Probably not. You probably have nothing in your bylaws about record retention or record keeping, but some stratas have added bylaws on this. So if yours has, then of course you need to follow it. So you follow the act, follow the regulation, and then follow your bylaws if you have anything. So hopefully your records don't look like this, though I have talked to some stratas whose records do look like this. So you need to decide how you're going to store those records, where are you going to store them, and who is going to store them. So as for how to store your records, there's lots of options. You can store them online, you can store them in paper, you can store them in your personal computer, or perhaps you have a Strata Council computer. You can store them all on USB sticks. Some of us might still be storing them on computer disks. You can use a combination. But the best practice is to always have a backup. So no matter how your records are stored, always have a backup. I'd be really surprised if the Google company, for example, was to go out of business. But if all your records are stored in the Google Drive and Google was to go out of business, how would you retrieve your records? So always think about the worst case scenario and think, how on earth could I retain these records? How could I get a copy of these records if my primary source is gone? If you've got them in a paper filing cabinet, maybe you want to keep a backup in your personal computer. If they're only in your computer, maybe you want to keep a backup in the cloud. So where to store the records? There's so many options, right? And I'm certainly not an expert in any of this. I'm a Luddite, but you can store them in your own Strata website, perhaps, or your management company might host a website where you are storing your records. You've got Google Drive. You can store them in a private online host. You can keep them in a simple filing cabinet. You can store them on USBs, your own computer, and as I said, your council might have your own computer. And do you have an office for your records in your strata, or are they kept in your homes? Some stratas have the luxury of a separate office for your records. Now, who's going to store the records? Is it going to be all council members, just the president? Sometimes just the secretary has the responsibility, but who's got the backup? Perhaps it's the president and the secretary with copies, whatever works for your strata. Now, if it's an electronic record keeping system, who has the passwords? Is it going to be all council members? Is it going to be just 2 council members? You need to decide that amongst yourselves in your council. You also have to balance access control with access to those who need it. If you give the password, for example, to your electronic storage, can a council member who's less skilled accidentally delete something? So perhaps that's a reason to keep the passwords only to those who have the skills to use it. So that's something that your own Strata Council should decide. Now, the downside with that, of course, is that every new council every year can change the policies and the procedures. So that's why I say some stratas have made bylaws about records so that it's not changed from one year to the next. Now, another thing to consider is, do you share a computer with others? My computer is only used for myself, but if I had a spouse or children using my computer, I would definitely find some other way to store my Strata Council records. So that's something to consider. Make sure you consider who else shares your computer. If you're old school and have a filing cabinet, is it kept locked? Who has the key? Can your 16-year-old child get the council records? So all things to consider. So requests for records are important. You're going to get lots of people requesting your records. Mostly owners, of course. Owners and realtors is who's going to request the records most often. So we'll talk about what records are owners entitled to, what they're not entitled to, and who else is entitled to your strata's records and timelines for responses. So owners are basically entitled to all the records that are identified in section 35. What they're not entitled to is records that are not identified in section 35. Seems pretty straightforward. But who else is entitled is basically anyone authorized in writing by an owner or the tenant who's been given the owner's rights. So that's where the realtors come in. The timelines for responses to requests are important. When a document request is made, you need to provide them within 1 week if it's bylaws and rules, or 2 weeks for anything else. And also the forms that the realtors will ask for, the Form Bs and the Form Fs, those are going to be required within 1 week. When you receive record requests, you need to make sure you understand what they're asking for. And so the BC Real Estate Association has a form which we've got up on the Vizoa website. It helps people sort of tick some boxes of what forms they want. And the Real Estate Association developed that form in conjunction with Vizoa reps from the Condominium Homeowners Association, the Vancouver Island Real Estate Board. So it's really a form designed for realtors, but it's helpful for owners as well. If your owners are requesting records, maybe give them a copy of the form and say, you know, please tick the boxes so we know specifically what you're looking for. So first thing you do when you get a request for records is check the deadline. So you might have a deadline in your bylaw that's different from the Strata Property Act. It could be a shorter deadline. I'd be surprised if you did, but you never know. So the Strata Property Act, section 35, talks about the deadline, and make sure you know what the deadline is. The next thing to do is check and see, is it a record they're entitled to? There are a few records that people are not entitled to. So what I'm trying to say there is don't waste your time digging up records that somebody may not be entitled to. Is it a request for a viewing of a record or a request for an actual copy of the record? So you need to know what they want to do. And we'll talk about viewing a little bit later as well. Are you providing a digital or a paper copy? Again, that's going to make a little difference as to how much time it'll take you to gather that record. Make sure you're clear on what they want. If the request is for an email with a bunch of attachments, that's great. If it's a request for a paper copy, you are entitled to request the fee for the paper copying before you provide the record. And is it something you can lay your hands on fairly quickly, or will it take you a little time to gather it? So as soon as you get that record request, consider all these things so you can decide how much time you need to devote to gathering those records. So of course you have to provide the records within the timelines outlined in the Act, but sooner is better if you can manage it. Now, if the request seems overly broad, ask for clarification. And again, that's where the form that I was speaking about might come handy. So if they're asking for all the correspondence, well, ask them to clarify which correspondence they want, just a specific topic. So just ask for clarification. And then if the request is still very broad, you can say, well, you know, Mrs. Jones, that's going to be about 800 pages and we're entitled to charge you up to 25 cents per page. Are you sure you want all those pages? And so that might get Mrs. Jones to cull down her request to what she actually wants. Now the fees are optional. You don't have to charge a fee at all, but you can charge up to 25 cents per page. And of course you can request that the fees be paid first before you go out and get the copies made. You'll need to give an estimate, and it doesn't have to be exact. Give an estimate of there's 810 pages, so it's going to cost X to have them provided. Please pay that fee first. And if it ends up being 815 pages instead of 810, you've cut yourself out of $1.25, but that won't hurt anything. So yes, you can ask that fees be paid first. The other documents that you'll be requested, in addition to just records from owners, is you might be asked for the Form B and the Form F when a unit is being sold. So the Form B The fee for that is $35 plus up to 25 cents per page. And those can be, of course, several hundred pages because you need to attach your depreciation report. So make sure you get what's coming to you when you do a Form B. The Form F, there's a flat fee of $15. Now, quite often you'll get a request for documents from realtors and they want them rushed. They don't want to have to wait the legislated time, which is 1 week for their Form B and 2 weeks for things like minutes. If you can provide them sooner, that's great, but don't be rushed because, of course, the Form B is a legal document. Rush fees are not outlined in the Strata Property Act, so you can sort of charge what you think is fair for your time for getting it to them in a rush. You can say, this will be the price if I give it to you in 1 week as outlined in the Act, quote on the price and say, but if you'd like it sooner, I can get it to you in 4 days and it'll be an extra $200 or $300 or whatever you think is fair. So if you have a strata manager, your management company is going to keep most of your records for you. They'll charge a fee. It's usually a fairly reasonable fee for storing your records, but they must return them to you within 60 days if the contract with your management company ends. So that's the first big difference. They're probably going to be the one responding to most of your records requests, but not always. It might be a simple document that a council member can do and not get the manager involved. But when the management company is changing, if you're changing from one company to the other, they're required to provide those records to you within 60 days. But I have heard some horror stories of management companies providing a box of unsorted files or a single PDF document that's unsearchable. It's got copies of all your records. And wouldn't that be awful to receive your records in that manner from your management company, or to have them turned over to the new management company like that? So that's why I always say to keep a backup copy yourself, not just rely on the strata manager to keep your records for you. So again, with a management company, if fees are charged for copies of records, the fees go to the management company and not to the strata. If you have a management company and they're charging for viewing records, the strata pays the fee, not the requester. So again, that's another good reason to keep your records, at least a copy of your records, on site. You can't charge an owner for viewing the records, but the management company could charge the strata for an owner to come to the office and view the records. And the reason for that, of course, is they don't want the owners going through all their files. They want to supervise the owner and make sure that they're only seeing what they're entitled to see. So if the records are in your strata filing cabinet, you can lay them out on a table. The owner can go through them at their leisure. You can't charge for that. But you could provide them an electronic copy, no charge, to get them out of your council room or get them out of your dining room, wherever your records are stored. But again, if the management company is charging fees for copies of records, they keep those fees. So things to consider with your, however you're storing your records, is you need to really consider how you're ensuring the privacy of those records, how to make sure that only the people in your storage location who are entitled to see those records are able to see them. You need to think about how to sort and organize your files so you can dig up what you need in a hurry. But maybe hurry is not the right word. So you can dig up what an owner is requesting in a timely manner. So think about how you can best do that. And we could spend hours speaking about organizing files, organizing records, but those are things you need to consider and think about. And perhaps your council might want to sit down for an hour at the beginning of each term and decide how you're going to organize your files for the year. But the most important thing you need to think about is where are they kept and who has access, for sure. As I said, you might want to have an open room where all council members have access, but you may not. And that's going to depend on the culture of your strata. It's also going to depend on your demographics, how many council members you have, whether you have a secure place for only council members to get them, or whether the council members are coming to your home office and looking through your filing cabinets. Those are all things to think about. But one other thing is how often to purge your records. So as I said earlier, you don't need to dispose of records after the minimum timelines outlined in the regulation. You can certainly keep them longer, but eventually you'll run out of space. Another strata I lived in had a huge room with several filing cabinets, and so there were records going back to the the 80s. And I think even before that, it was difficult to find things when you needed them, but the records were always there. So if you've got the space and you have a good filing system, there's nothing wrong to keep those records. But if you have a shortage of space, physical space or computer space, then you may want to set up a regular schedule for purging. Just make sure that you keep a copy of the checklist for timelines for retention handy, so you're not purging things too soon. You want to make sure, if in doubt, keep it is the best rule of thumb. And we're going to talk about just a little bit about whether the Civil Resolution Tribunal has addressed record keeping, and they have. So just if you are interested in records for Civil Resolution Tribunal decisions, just go to the website. The link is there on the screen. Search for records, search for documents, document requests. You'll see numerous results. There's just a couple of interesting cases I'm going to highlight for you. The Lee versus EPS 1069, and the CRT reference number is up there. The owner had requested a great deal of records. The strata had separate sections, each with its own property manager. For those of you without sections, you won't know what that means. But if you have sections, they should each have their own property manager. So it wasn't clear to the two managers which records would be provided by which manager, which was kind of interesting. So it took them a little time to sort out the requests. And it was compounded by a recent change in property managers. There's that 60-day period where the new manager doesn't have the records yet. The old manager hasn't yet got them organized and transferred them over. So the owner did eventually receive the records, but it was well past the deadline. And in that case, no penalty was assessed, but it was very frustrating for the owner. Another similar strata case from the Civil Resolution Tribunal, the Mitha case, Mitha versus VR 2192. The management company held the records, and the strata refused to pay for the requester to view the records because they had recently ended their contract with that strata manager. So the strata says, well, we don't want to pay for the requester to view these records, so we're not dealing with you anymore. So that was frustrating for the owner who's requesting the records. The strata did eventually agree to provide those records, but it was quite some time later, and they wanted the copying fee to be paid first. So the CRT found that the strata had to provide those records at no charge because they did not provide them within the timeline. The request was overly broad, though, and the CRT listed many records that did not need to be provided. And that sort of segues us into one Supreme Court case to note. As I said, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not going to try to decipher this case for you in great detail, but it's referred to often in the CRT cases. And it's the Kane case. Kane versus LMS 2375. So in this case, the court found that a document or record not outlined in Section 35 of the Act is generally not available to an owner or tenant. And I said that earlier, and this is, of course, where I get my knowledge from. The court found that an owner is entitled to receive books of account and the associated financial records, but not the underlying bills, invoices, or receipts reflected in those statements. So that's interesting to note. You'll quite often get owners requesting invoices, receipts, etc. It doesn't mean you can't give them to them, but you're not required to. So keep that in mind and just come up with a policy that works for your strata. If there is a particular invoice, a best practice here, if there's a particular invoice that you do want to share with an owner, think about, is your personal email or phone number on there? You might want to redact that before you provide it to them. But here's some other best practices for you. So the most important thing with your strata records is to be transparent. Just don't have anything to hide. Just because you don't have to provide a record doesn't mean you can't, as I mentioned with invoices. If an owner really wants to see an invoice, what have you got to hide? What is the reason you're not giving them the invoice? I can see in the Kane case, maybe the owner wanted 200 invoices going back a couple of years. Well, of course, the court said no. But just because you don't have to doesn't mean you can't. And here's an interesting one. Just because you can charge a fee doesn't mean you need to charge a fee. So think about that. But if you're not going to charge the fee, you need to come up with some guidelines within your strata so that you're consistent from one request to the next. Maybe you can't say, well, we won't charge Mrs. Jones for the records because we like her, but we're going to charge Mr. Smith because we don't like him. Don't do that. Be very consistent, please. Correspondence can be tricky. So I want to not spend much time on correspondence for sure. Refer to the Office of the Information and Privacy Commissioner guidelines. We'll have the link for that at the end for correspondence. But I caution you when you're doing emailing to owners, emailing between council members, my preference and a best practice is to have a separate email account for your Strata business so that you don't use your personal home email, which can be read by your spouse or whoever. Keep a separate email address for your council business. That's something to think about because, of course, emails are correspondence. Nobody writes a letter anymore. It's all done by email. There's tons of resources for you up on the VISOA website. There's some links to these and of course more. The Strata Property Act is of course up on our website and the regulation. The document retention guidelines that I spoke about is up on the website. The document request form is also there and there's a great deal of links to privacy resources. And here are of course some other resources for you for any of your Strata needs. Thank you for attending today. We've left a great deal of time for question and answer.
I'd like to just take a moment and thank Sandy so much for joining us today and presenting this very important topic. It's a topic that we get asked for quite often.